as you went through the other phyla for kingdom fungi, I kind of let you try to figure out on your own what the different characteristics were of some of these different phyla. So today we're going to go over it and make sure that you were able to get your chart filled out correctly, go over a few of the details just in case any of them are a little bit fuzzy. In the last video, we did talk a lot about phylum Zygomycota, and so those are just called zygote fungi. And so we talked about how the rhizoid hyphae are the ones that you have a plus and a minus. They fuse together. They form a zygote or a zygospore. And an example of that was bread mold. They do not produce a fruiting body. So a fruiting body just means that that's the place where they form a specialized structure to hold and release those spores. But phylum Zygomycota does not do that. The next type of fungi that you read about were the sac fungi, which are called Ascomycota. And they're called Ascomycota because when the sporangiophores make a specialized structure to hold their spores, those structures are sacs called asci. The one that you specifically studied was the yeast, which is actually single cellular, unicellular. And we talked about how they also produce by budding, which looks very familiar to binary fission that we talked about in Kingdom Protista, but budding is a little bit different because in budding, you've got the parent cell and the budding cell, it is dividing, but they stay attached together until both cells are grown and mature before they split apart. In binary fission, you don't really have the growing and maturing of the cells before they split. They just split and then they each continue to grow on their own. So that was the sac fungus. Again, there you've got the spores that have been sexually produced, but they are being held in sacs called asci. And so you're going to have a fruiting body that's going to hold these sacs in order for them to be released. The next one that we looked at was the club fungi, which is phylum Basidiomycota, and they form their sexual spores on these club-like structures called basidia. Most common representative of that phyla is a mushroom. You may also, though, have seen shelf fungi or puffballs if you do a lot of walking in the woods. And so those funguses are very prevalent. We see a lot of them. Again, there is a fruiting body, and the mushrooms that we see are actually just the fruiting body. Remember that that's not the main part of the fungus. The main part of the fungus lives under the ground. We hardly ever see it. There's just a very small portion of the year when we actually see mushrooms out in the yard. For us, it's normally in the spring of the year when we see a lot of those. Sometimes we see them in the fall as well, but we do see a lot of them in the spring when it's very, very wet outside. And so the mushrooms are the fruiting bodies that hold the basidia that are going to have the basidia spores on them that have been reproduced sexually. One other thing that you talked about or that you read about when you read about the club fungi was how these mushrooms actually form. So I just want to talk about that very briefly. Hopefully that the diagram that was in your book made some sense. So it starts out with the sexual reproduction, just like we talked about in Zygomycota, where you've got the two pieces of the mycelia, a plus and a minus, that are going to fuse together. It's a little different this time because as the new mycelia is formed, they enclose themselves in a membrane, which is called the button stage of the mushroom. Then the hyphae fill up with water, and then eventually the membrane bursts because the mycelia just gets too big. And then your stipe and your cap break forth from that. And that's why it just seems that these mushrooms just kind of pop up overnight, because that's actually almost what happens. They're inside the membrane, and then it fills with water, and then eventually it bursts and the mushrooms are going to pop up. Then your basidiospores are released from the gills of the mushroom. So you want to make sure that you understand that process. You can put those steps in order as to how those mushrooms kind of pop out of the ground. Okay, so the mushrooms are the fruiting body of the mushroom. The two other phyla she didn't really spend a whole lot of time on, and we aren't going to either, but I do want you to know the names and what puts them into that particular phyla. The chytrid fungi are it's phylum Chytridiomycota. They are the only ones where your spores have flagella on them. And so while all of the other spores can't move on their own, they are completely dependent on where the wind or other animals may take them. These spores have flagella and can move. They're called motile, M-O-T-I-L-E, motile spores. They can move on their own. The example she gave you was of a potato wart, and here we're not concerning ourselves about fruiting bodies simply because these guys, these spores have flagella and they can move on their own. The final type of phyla is kind of a holding phyla almost, because scientists are assuming that most types of fungi are going to have a sexual method of reproduction, but that they just haven't figured out what that method is for all of them yet. And so if they don't know the method of sexual reproduction, they call them imperfect fungi, not because the fungi themselves are imperfect, but because our understanding of them is imperfect. We don't know how they sexually reproduce, so that's why they're put into this category. It's called Deuteromycota, and we don't know how they sexually reproduce. We assume there's a method, but we just don't know what it is. And the biggest example of that is penicillin, which even the ancient Egyptians knew about, because they knew that if they put a piece of moldy bread on an infection, a lot of times it would clear up. And so we're assuming that, probably not the same kind of bread mold that was up here, but a similar type of mold that was growing, and they found that if they would put that on an infection, it would clear up. So even the ancient Egyptians were using antibiotics, even though they didn't realize that that's what they were using. Very thankful for the development of penicillin and other antibiotics to help us fight off a lot of the diseases that we struggle with. So these are the five main types of fungi and the five major phyla that I'm going to ask you to know. So you want to make sure that you know the type of fungi, the type of sexual reproduction, and an example of each one of those would be a good thing too.